On a bright and busy afternoon, in the middle of a city full of people rushing about their day, a tragic event occurred. It began like many police calls do. Officers were responding to a situation involving a woman who had allegedly been involved in something small, a matter that should have been resolved quickly. She was stopped by an officer for a minor reason, and while the details were unclear, the situation escalated in an instant. This woman, a mother, never imagined that this simple moment could lead to a tragedy. She wasn't someone who caused trouble, and everyone who knew her spoke of how loving and hardworking she was. But in that instant, things took a deadly turn. As the officer tried to control the situation, the woman was forcibly restrained on the ground. The officer, his knee pressing down on her neck, had no idea what he was doing. He didn't realize how dangerous it was, and he didn't seem to notice the woman's struggles as she gasped for breath. The scene was chaotic and distressing. People nearby, some of whom had gathered to watch the interaction, quickly began to shout, urging the officer to stop. But the officer didn't listen. The woman's cries for help grew weaker, and soon it was clear that she was no longer breathing. In a matter of moments, her life was taken away, all because of a small misunderstanding that should never have gone this far. A crowd gathered, filming the shocking event on their phones, unable to believe their eyes. Some were in disbelief, others were angry, but everyone was heartbroken. The video of the officer's actions spread quickly on social media, and soon, news outlets across the country were reporting on the incident. The images of the woman lying motionless on the ground, while the officer continued to hold her down, were burned into the minds of viewers everywhere. The tragedy went beyond just one woman's life being taken too soon. It sparked something much bigger. The video didn't just show a life lost. It showed a deep problem in society. People began asking questions. Why did this happen? Why did this officer act this way? And why had it taken so long for the world to wake up to such injustice? What no one knew, however, was that the woman was not just any regular person. She had a son who had built an empire, a quiet and private man who had worked hard and achieved incredible success. But in that moment, he was thousands of miles away, focused on his work, unaware that his life was about to change forever. While the world mourned the loss of a mother, the son remained in the dark, unaware of what was happening to his family. Little did the officer know that the woman he had just taken from the world had a son with a story of his own, one that would soon intertwine with the tragedy in ways no one could have predicted. As news of the tragic incident spread like wildfire, protests began to erupt in different parts of the city and beyond. People were furious, not just about the life that was lost, but about the injustice they had witnessed. The video of the woman's final moments became a symbol of a much larger issue that had been ignored for too long. It was clear to everyone who watched that the officer's actions were wrong, but the question remained, how could this be allowed to happen again and again? In the midst of the growing uproar, one person was still in shock, unable to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. The woman's son, who had been completely unaware of what was happening to his mother, was still going about his daily life. He had built an incredible career in the tech world, achieving success beyond what most people could imagine. But he had always kept his private life out of the public eye. He wasn't someone who craved attention or wanted the world to know his every move. Instead, he focused on building his empire and quietly helping others along the way. The son had grown up with his mother's love and guidance. She was the one who had encouraged him to pursue his dreams and supported him through every challenge he faced. It was her strength and wisdom that had shaped him into the person he had become. He had always kept his distance from the media, preferring to stay grounded and focused on his goals. Yet, as the news of his mother's death reached him, his life was suddenly turned upside down. When he first heard the news, he couldn't believe it. He was in the middle of a meeting, discussing a major project with his team when the call came. His lawyer, who had been in contact with the family, was the one to break the news to him. At first, he thought it was some kind of mistake. His mother couldn't be gone. She had always been there for him, supporting him through everything. But as the details started to sink in, it became painfully clear that what he had heard was true. His mother had been killed in an unjust and senseless act of violence. The son felt a wave of grief wash over him, but also a rising sense of anger. How could this have happened to her? Why was it that someone who had always been kind and loving was treated this way? It felt like the world had taken something precious from him, and he couldn't understand why. At the same time, he felt helpless, as though there was nothing he could do to bring her back. His mother, the woman who had shaped his life, was gone, and he was left to carry the weight of her memory. As he began to process the pain, he also began to think about what he could do next. He wasn't just any son. He was a man with the means to make a difference. He had built his success from the ground up, and now he had the resources to ensure that his mother's death wouldn't be in vain. But he knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. He would need to gather his strength, his resolve, and fight for justice, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had been affected by the violence that had claimed her life. Little did he know, the journey ahead would bring him face to face with challenges he had never imagined, and his mother's death would become a turning point in his life, one that would push him to use his success for something much greater than himself. The moment the news of the tragic event reached the woman's son, the weight of it all seemed almost unbearable. He was devastated by the loss of his mother, a woman who had always been a steady presence in his life. She had been the one to guide him, support him, and encourage him to chase his dreams, no matter the obstacles. Now he was left with nothing but the painful reality of her death and a growing sense of injustice. But as the world reacted to the tragedy, something even bigger started to unfold. The video of the incident had already gone viral. People across the country were sharing it, discussing it, and demanding answers. It was hard to ignore. The haunting image of the officer's knee pressing down on the woman's neck had captured the world's attention. The footage wasn't just a recording of a single moment in time. It was a glaring reminder of a larger problem that had been brewing for years. It showed a moment of blatant disregard for human life, and people weren't going to let it slip by unnoticed. As the story spread across news outlets, protesters took to the streets. They gathered in large numbers, calling for justice, not just for the woman who had been killed, but for the countless others who had been victims of similar acts of violence. Signs, banners, and chants filled the air as people from all walks of life united in their call for change. They marched in silence, in defiance, and in the hope that their voices would be heard. The pain of the woman's death had become a spark that ignited a larger movement, one that demanded accountability and reform. In the midst of this growing public outcry, the woman's son found himself thrust into the spotlight. Though he had spent his entire life avoiding the public eye, the circumstances of his mother's death made it impossible to remain in the shadows. Reporters wanted answers, activists wanted his support, and people everywhere wanted to hear from the son of the woman who had become a symbol of injustice. At first, he wasn't sure how to respond. His emotions were still raw, and he wasn't prepared to speak out so publicly. But as he saw the faces of those who were grieving alongside him, he realized he couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about something much bigger. His mother's death had become a symbol for all the lives lost, all the families affected by violence and injustice. The anger, the sadness, the frustration that people were feeling, it was something he shared, something he couldn't ignore. He knew that the fight for justice for his mother had to be a fight for everyone who had been wronged by a system that often turned a blind eye to the suffering of others. He decided that he couldn't let his mother's death be forgotten or swept aside. With a heavy heart, but a determined spirit, he began to speak out. His words were measured, his tone calm, but there was a fire behind them that could not be ignored. He didn't just want justice for his mother. He wanted change. He wanted to see a world where something like this couldn't happen again, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. As the days passed, the world continued to react. The protests grew larger, the calls for accountability louder. And the woman's son, though still grieving, found himself becoming a voice for the movement, What had started as a personal tragedy was now something much greater, a movement for justice, for equality, and for a future where people would no longer have to fear the very systems that were meant to protect them. As the woman's son became more involved in the fight for justice, he began to understand the power of his position in a way he hadn't before. Despite his grief, he realized that his success, built over years of hard work, gave him an opportunity to make a real difference. He wasn't just any businessman. He had quietly amassed a fortune, developing a reputation in the tech industry as someone who didn't chase the spotlight, but focused on creating valuable innovations. His rise had been slow, steady, and deliberate. He had never wanted fame or recognition. He preferred to work behind the scenes, away from the attention that often followed successful entrepreneurs. But now, his world had changed in an instant. His mother's death had catapulted him into the public eye, forcing him to reckon with a reality that was as complicated as it was painful. In the days that followed, reporters, activists, and curious individuals all began to dig into his background. The media quickly uncovered the details of his business ventures, his wealth, and his success. Despite his private nature, there was no escaping the fact that he was now in the center of a national conversation, one that extended far beyond his personal loss. Yet, despite the sudden attention, the son remained grounded. He had never been one to flaunt his wealth. He didn't believe in unnecessary luxury or drawing attention to his financial achievements. To him, the wealth was just a tool, something to help him achieve his goals, but not something to define him. His focus had always been on using his success to create opportunities, to help others, and to quietly build a future that could make a difference. But now, he saw how this wealth could be a platform for something far greater than anything he had imagined. His mother had always been the driving force in his life, and her passing had left a hole that nothing could fill. But as he reflected on her teachings and the life she had given him, he realized that he had inherited more than just her love and guidance. He had inherited a responsibility. She had instilled in him a deep sense of justice, of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. And now, as the world looked to him for leadership, he knew that he had to honor her memory in the best way he knew how, by fighting for justice, not only for her but for every person who had been affected by violence, discrimination, and injustice. In the wake of his mother's death, he began to take action. He contacted legal experts, worked with advocacy groups, and began speaking out on social media and in public forums. The media, hungry for answers and insights from the son of the woman whose tragic death had sparked a nationwide movement, began to ask him questions about what he planned to do next. His responses were calm but resolute. He was determined to use his resources to push for real change, to ensure that his mother's death was not in vain. But while his words carried weight, the son knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. His mother's legacy, he realized, was not just in the love she had given him, but in the way she had shown him how to stand up for others, how to fight for fairness. As he began to speak more publicly, he could feel the eyes of the world upon him, but he wasn't afraid. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges, but he was ready. His mother had always taught him that nothing worth fighting for comes easily. And now, with the strength of her memory guiding him, he would carry that lesson forward, no matter what it took. As the son began to grasp the full weight of his mother's death, he found himself overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. Grief, anger, and confusion flooded his mind. His mother, the woman who had always been his pillar, who had shaped him into the person he was gone. It felt unreal, like something out of a nightmare. But as he began to gather himself, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let this tragedy define him by sorrow alone. He had to act. The news of his mother's death had already sparked a national outcry. People everywhere were demanding justice, not just for her, but for every individual who had suffered at the hands of a broken system. The footage of the incident had gone viral, and it seemed like the whole world was watching, waiting for answers. While the media focused on the horrific nature of the event, the son turned his focus to a different task: making sure that the tragedy did not slip through the cracks like so many others before it. His first step was to meet with his family's lawyer, who had been helping the family with legal matters for years. The lawyer, a calm and steady presence in the midst of such chaos, explained the process ahead. It was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. There were questions that needed answering. Why did the officer act in such a way? What could have been done differently? And perhaps most importantly, how could the system that allowed this to happen be held accountable? The son didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to see this through. He couldn't let his mother's death fade into the background like so many others had. She deserved justice, and he would fight for it, not just for her, but for all the lives lost in similar ways. The thought of how easily things could have been different made his blood boil, but it also fueled his resolve. He wasn't just a grieving son anymore. He was a man on a mission. The lawyer worked tirelessly to gather the necessary evidence, reviewing the video footage, talking to witnesses, and collecting statements. Meanwhile, the son began to speak publicly about what had happened. His words were carefully chosen, filled with emotion, but also with the clarity of someone who understood the importance of what was at stake. He didn't want to make this about him. He wanted to make it about his mother's memory and the fight for justice. His speeches and interviews became a rallying cry for those who were already standing up against the injustice of it all. But as the days went on, the pressure began to mount. The media was relentless in its pursuit of answers, and activists continued to push for swift action. The son found himself balancing the need for a thoughtful legal approach with the desire to see justice served quickly. He knew that the public's attention wouldn't last forever, and he couldn't afford to let the momentum fade. The challenge now was to turn that momentum into real change. It wasn't just about the court case, though. The son understood that real change required more than just holding one officer accountable. It required a fundamental shift in how society viewed issues of justice, equality, and police accountability. His mother's death had become a symbol, but it could also be the spark that lit a fire for change. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, he was willing to take it. With his legal team pushing forward, and the public outcry growing louder by the day, the son knew that his journey was only just beginning. His fight wasn't just for his mother's justice. It was for a future where people could feel safe, heard, and respected. And no matter how difficult it became, he would carry that hope forward, every step of the way. As the days turned into weeks, the legal battle began to take shape. The son, still deeply grieving his mother, realized that the fight for justice would be a long and difficult one. He had prepared himself for the emotional toll, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the intricacies of navigating the legal system. Despite his success in the business world, this was uncharted territory. He was now faced with the harsh realities of a system that, for many, had failed to deliver justice time and time again. The legal team he had hired worked tirelessly to build a case. They pored over every detail, reviewing evidence, talking to witnesses, and piecing together the moments leading up to the incident. The video footage, which had become a focal point of the public outcry, was a key part of the case, but it was also a constant reminder of the pain and loss his family had suffered. Each time he saw it, the son felt the familiar ache of his mother's absence, but he knew that every moment counted. He couldn't afford to let the emotions overwhelm him. This was about justice, and he had to stay focused. The media, which had once been so relentless in its pursuit of the story, now watched closely as the legal process unfolded. Reporters and journalists were eager for updates, but the son kept his words measured. He didn't want to make this about himself. He wanted to keep the focus on the issues at hand. The injustice his mother had faced was not just about one officer or one tragic incident. It was about a larger problem, one that affected countless people across the country. He was fighting for something bigger than his own grief. He was fighting for all those who had been wronged and silenced. As the court dates approached, tensions rose. Activists, who had been vocal from the start, continued to demand swift action. They rallied in the streets, held vigils, and urged the public to keep the pressure on. The son knew their support was crucial. The movement had grown far beyond his mother's death. It had become a symbol for all those who had suffered from injustice, but he also knew that change would not come easily. The legal system was complex, and reform would require more than just winning a case. Through it all, the son leaned on the lessons his mother had taught him. She had always believed in doing what was right, no matter how hard it seemed. Her unwavering moral compass had guided him throughout his life, and now, in the face of unimaginable pain, it continued to guide him. He wasn't just fighting for a verdict. He was fighting for a future where no one else would have to endure what his mother had suffered. The case, as complicated and drawn out as it was, had become a beacon of hope for many. It was a reminder that people, no matter how much they had or how little, could come together to demand change. The son, though still grieving, had found a new purpose. With each passing day, he knew that the fight for justice was his mother's legacy, a legacy that he would carry forward with the same strength and determination she had shown him throughout his life. The road ahead was still long, but he was prepared. The movement was growing, and he was ready to lead it, for her, and for all those who needed a voice. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the public's attention continued to focus on the case, and the pressure mounted with each passing day. The son was no longer just a businessman. He had become a leader, a figurehead for a movement that was pushing for change on a national scale. What had begun as a personal tragedy was now a rallying cry for justice, not just for his mother, but for all those who had been affected by similar injustices. The weight of this responsibility was not lost on him, and he found himself juggling his grief with the need to stay strong and focused for the cause. He had always been a private person, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight, but the situation had forced him to step forward. It wasn't just about his mother's legacy anymore. It was about ensuring that no other family had to experience the same heartbreak. The son knew that the public's attention wouldn't last forever, and he had to make sure that the momentum continued to build. It wasn't just about holding the officer accountable. It was about reforming a system that had allowed such events to happen in the first place. In the days leading up to the trial, the son spent countless hours meeting with legal experts, advocacy groups, and community leaders. He wanted to make sure that the case wasn't just about his family. It was about something much larger. He knew that the true fight would not end with the court ruling. Real change, he believed, would only come when people united to hold those in power accountable and demand a system that treated everyone equally. It wasn't an easy fight, and the son knew that there would be setbacks along the way, but he was prepared to face them head-on. Meanwhile, the protests continued. They grew larger and louder as more people joined the cause. The streets were filled with people from all walks of life, united in their call for justice. It was inspiring to see so many voices coming together, but the son also knew that this was just the beginning. He had seen firsthand how quickly public attention could shift, and he didn't want the world to forget his mother's story. She had become a symbol for a much larger issue, but her life was not just a symbol. It was a real human story, one that deserved to be heard. Despite the intensity of the public's response, the son remained focused. He didn't want the case to be overshadowed by noise or drama. He knew that the legal system had its own course to follow, and while he worked tirelessly to bring attention to the case, he also had to trust in the process. There were moments when doubt crept in, when he questioned whether the system would truly deliver justice, or if his mother's death would be just another forgotten tragedy. But he held on to hope, believing that the only way forward was to keep pushing, keep fighting, and keep his focus on the long-term goal, real, lasting change. The trial finally began, and the son found himself facing a new wave of emotions. It was one thing to talk about his mother's death and all that had happened in the aftermath, but now he was standing in a courtroom, confronting the very reality of what had been done to her. The pain was still raw, but he knew that he couldn't afford to let it consume him. This was his chance to stand for something bigger than his personal grief, to fight for justice on behalf of his mother and everyone who had been affected by the same injustices. As the trial unfolded, The son began to see the magnitude of what he was up against, but he was not backing down. He had promised his mother, and to himself, that he would continue this fight until the end. He wasn't just seeking justice for her. He was seeking a better future for everyone who had suffered because of the same issues. And with each step, each challenge, he grew more determined to see this through. His mother's voice, though silent now, still guided him, reminding him that no matter how hard the journey, the fight for justice was always worth it. As the trial came to a close, the son felt a mix of emotions: anxiety, hope, and a deep sense of anticipation. For weeks, he had witnessed the proceedings, listening carefully to every piece of testimony, every argument made by both sides. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. But through it all, he kept his focus on one simple truth: his mother's life mattered, and her death could not be forgotten. He knew that this moment was crucial, not just for his family, but for the movement that had grown around her name. People were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The courtroom was filled with people who had come to support the cause. They were a diverse group: activists, community leaders, and everyday people who had been touched by the tragedy. Many of them had seen the footage, shared it with their families, and felt compelled to take a stand. It wasn't just about one individual. It was about a system that needed change. The son understood the significance of their presence, and as he looked around the room, he felt a sense of solidarity. These people weren't just bystanders. They were part of something bigger, a movement that demanded justice. The son's legal team had worked tirelessly, presenting the case with precision and clarity. They had laid out the facts, shown the undeniable evidence, and made a compelling argument for accountability. But even with all the evidence stacked in their favor, the son knew that the outcome was never guaranteed. He had seen how many cases like his mother's had ended without justice. He couldn't let himself get too hopeful, but he also couldn't stop fighting. He had to believe that the truth would prevail, that the right thing would be done. As the judge prepared to deliver the verdict, the courtroom grew silent. The tension in the air was palpable, and the son could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His heart raced as he waited for the judge to speak. His thoughts went to his mother, to the life she had lived, and to the lessons she had taught him. She had always told him to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. And that's exactly what he was doing now. He wasn't just fighting for his mother's memory. He was fighting for a future where no one else had to experience the same heartbreak. Finally, the judge spoke. The verdict was read aloud, and the courtroom erupted in reactions. It wasn't just a ruling. It was a statement. It was a moment of reckoning, a sign that the system could and should change. The son felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was mixed with sadness. His mother was gone, and no verdict could bring her back. But in that moment, he realized that her death had sparked something far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Her legacy would live on in the movement for justice, in the changes that would come, and in the lives that would be forever impacted by the courage to stand up and fight for what was right. The trial was over, but the journey was far from finished. The son knew that the fight for justice didn't end with a single court ruling. It was just the beginning. He had seen firsthand how powerful a united community could be, how their voices could move mountains and demand change. He would continue to push for reform, to hold the system accountable, and to ensure that his mother's memory was honored in a way that brought lasting change. As he walked out of the courtroom, the son felt a sense of peace. He had done everything he could to honor his mother and fight for justice, and although the road ahead was still long, he knew that her spirit would continue to guide him. He had promised her that he would never give up, and with the support of the community that had rallied around him, he would keep that promise, no matter what it took. The fight for justice was far from over, but he was ready to lead the charge, and this time, he wasn't alone.